In recent years, celebrities have become increasingly political, shifting from one trendy cause to the next. In the United States, we saw this with the election of President Trump, and celebrities collectively losing their minds. In Australia, celebrities en masse endorsed the yes side of the voice referendum. However, now the news cycle has moved on, and celebrities have moved on to the next trendy progressive cause, this time the Israel-Palestine conflict. And much like with the voice referendum, celebrities have a lot to say, although don't seem to have much of value to say. The empty barrel makes the most noise. This recently resulted in 3 Sydney theatre company actors protesting in support of Palestine. They donned the keffeyah scarf, purportedly to show solidarity with Palestinians. Now, protests and political statements have been rather common at the Sydney Theatre Company, which included during the voice referendum. This protest was nothing new. However, the big difference was it was in support of Palestine at a time when Palestine was in conflict with Israel, particularly following the Hamas terrorist incident. Now, the backlash to this was intense. 3 Sydney Theatre Company directors have resigned from the board in protest. Donors have stopped donating. There's been an intense reaction, and this reflects a belief that the actors were supporting the Hamas terrorist action. Now, the actors didn't explicitly say this. Rather, they just donned a keffeyah scarf. However, that's how people interpret it. And oftentimes we're told that intention doesn't matter when people are aggressed or offended by a particular statement. So the actors maybe should have known better than to do something quite so blunt. And in any case, there was a backlash. This was to some extent made a little bit worse by some questionable Instagram posts from one of the actors that didn't exactly assuage people's fears. However, like I said, they didn't specifically endorse the Hamas actions. Rather, it just appeared to be tone deaf in the light of the fact that none of them seemingly came out and supported the Israelis or the Israeli families that were murdered. Now, I can see this is a rather fraught issue, and there are passions on both sides of the debate. And on the one hand, I can see that actors are entitled to have whatever political opinions they like. Anyone is entitled to have a political opinion. However, people aren't entitled to force people to listen to them. You, for example, could just stop listening to me if you don't like what I'm saying. That's what you have free will to do. However, I don't have free will to force you to listen to me, and similarly, actors should not be able to force people to listen to them. And this is the problem with the Sydney Theatre Company protest. People were forced to listen when they didn't want to, and people were forced to listen to a message that appeared to be supporting Hamas, at least in the eyes of some people, and appeared to not be sufficiently supporting the Israelis who were murdered or kidnapped or otherwise attacked. Now, the whole situation was a bit of a trash fire, and probably could have been managed much better than it was. But the whole situation appears to have now gotten exponentially worse. 3,200 supposed creatives have now signed an open letter, which is probably an exercise in what not to say in this situation. They have looked at a trash fire and decided to just throw gasoline onto it. So let's have a look at what they wrote. They start off by saying, "We are the artists, producers, front of house staff, audiences, and beyond who keep this industry alive. We're here, united, in Australia, in inverted commas, a colonised country built on the genocide and dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people in the struggle for liberation from colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing, and a call for immediate ceasefire and an end to occupation. We are calling for collective public actions of solidarity, and we are making demands of our government and of our arts institutions." So before we move on there, let's just disentangle this a little bit because they've made a few assertions. Firstly, they're tying First Nations causes to what's going on in Israel and Palestine, which it seems rather a large number of Indigenous Australians aren't too fond of. Just look, for example, at what Warren Mundine has been posting on LinkedIn as but one example. Warren Mundine is clearly not in favour of Hamas and clearly appears to be supporting Israel overall. Similarly, Marshall Langton has called for more empathy with the Israeli plight as well. It clearly is invalid to tie all Indigenous Australians to the Palestinian cause. Furthermore, we've got the claims that Israel is engaged in colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. Now, the most obviously problematic of these is ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing would seem to imply They're going out and removing or eliminating or simply murdering Palestinian people, which Israel isn't really doing. At the moment, Israel is engaged in a conflict in Palestine. They're engaged in a conflict because Hamas kidnapped a lot of their citizens, and Israel is trying to get those citizens back. If one is calling for a ceasefire, as this open letter is, they also need to propose a solution for how Israel is supposed to get its hostages back and also prevent Hamas engaging in yet another terrorist action. In any case, that's their first paragraph, a rather strong opening. They then continue on with a list of demands. They state, side by side, these First Nations and settler migrants of all generations and ancestries and identities demand 1. An end to Israeli occupation of Palestine. 2. For the Australian government and Foreign Minister Penny Wong to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. 3. For our arts institutions to join the call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. 4. For the safety and rights of artists to be honoured wherever they may work. Again, let's unpackage this. Firstly, Israel isn't really occupying Palestine per se. One can have concerns about settlements and the like, but we've got the West Bank and we've got Gaza, which Israel is not occupying. It is simply factually incorrect to argue that they are. Israel has some operations in the West Bank, however, two things apply here. First, the West Bank is not Gaza, they operate under different administrations, which don't really cooperate because the administration in the West Bank was actually thrown out of Gaza in a conflict with Hamas. Second, in the West Bank, Israel is providing services to the government in the West Bank, and therefore to some extent they're cooperating with the existing government. That's not an occupation, it is a cooperation. One can call out Israel for having engaged in maybe some ham-fisted actions in some cases. However, that's a far cry from them going the next step and saying Israel needs a ceasefire and needs to be treated as a punching bag so Hamas can do yet another action of this type, and so that Hamas can simply retain the hostages, and Israel will have no recourse to actually get them back. It's obviously ridiculous to demand a ceasefire with no solution to the hostage situation. The other one that is rather curious is the call for artists to be honoured wherever they may work, whatever that means. Who knows what that means? Are we supposed to all bow down and perhaps pray to the altar of the artist gods? Who knows what that means? But they want to be honoured. They continue on. This is urgent. The genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza has severely escalated since the end of the quote-unquote truce. We cannot become complacent or fatigued. Our resistance would not be overwritten, censored, or ignored. Acting publicly in support of the Palestinian liberation is necessary. From the successful artist boycott at the Sydney Festival in 2022, to the black cast of The Visitors through Mischaracterizing and Sydney Theatre Company, leading by example with a post-show statement. This is what global solidarity looks like. This didn't start with 3 actors wearing keffeyah at the curtain call of the Sydney Theatre Company's Seagull production, or the over 300 journalists who co-signed a letter asking for ethical journalistic practices to be upheld in the reporting of the siege on Gaza. The resistance is over 75 years long, and the momentum is only growing. Again, this is a complete mischaracterization of history. Throughout the course of those 75 years, they've neatly glossed over the First and Second Intifadas, which were violent uprisings, so to speak, against Israel, and involved some rather brutal actions from forces within Palestine. So this characterization of history is a little bit off. Furthermore, when they're talking about 300 journalists, there are vastly more than 300 journalists in the world or in Australia. And therefore, if we're looking at an open letter with 300 journalists, one has to ask, how many of them didn't sign the letter? Because 300 journalists signing a letter is pretty meaningless when the overwhelming majority didn't sign that same letter. And that letter, to be clear, was calling for Israel to be treated the same as Hamas in the reporting, i.e., Israel's evidence and Israel's statements to be treated with the same credibility or lack thereof as statements from Hamas, which was ridiculous given the context of the letter. They then continue on. These artists are not alone. Our power is our collective action. And so on Wednesday, 13th of December 2023, 1. Wear your keffeyah, lapel pin, or Palestinian solidarity shirt wherever you work. Show up in solidarity at your local gallery, theatre, venue, or art after hours, i.e. give us money. 3. Take a collective photo at work, share and post. Nothing like hashtag activism. 4. Add your signature. It seems like they either want a signature to the open letter or also signatures in emails, which have become all the rage. Next, We will not cross the line to fill vacated roles. And then finally, we will call out your covert censorship. I'm not totally sure what they're getting at here, but it seems this is a backlash to people being concerned about their protest. And these artists and these actors are entitled to say whatever they want, but we are also entitled to not listen and to tune into something else, much like anyone with free will has. It's not censorship to listen to someone else. It's not censorship to remove your donation when you simply don't want to donate to that cause anymore. If you don't feel that cause represents you, then ceasing your donation is perfectly within your rights. No artistic body, no Sydney Theatre Company or any other company is entitled to a donation. If that body acts in a way that people don't like, then they are perfectly entitled to stop donating. They're perfectly entitled to stop seeing the performances. There is no entitlement to have people go and watch you or to pay you money. But this letter seems to believe there actually is. They then call out the Sydney Theatre Company, which to my mind has not handled the situation really rather well, but in any case they state, "Shame on the Sydney Theatre Company for commodifying the black and brown bodies and our stories on their stages for their social and financial capital, while demanding they stay silent. Shame on the contemporary arts institutions that welcome Palestinian artists into their space, as long as they are silent. Shame on institutions that make moral compromises and preference for coddling their donors and subscribers. We refuse to be ushered into silent complicity." Now here again, there's a lot to unpackage. They're basically saying that these arts bodies are profiting off the labor of many of these artists. And to some extent, that's true, like any company profits off the labor of anyone else. They are an employee doing a job and the employer gets some profit. Or maybe doesn't get a profit depending on the case as the situation might be. In this case, Sydney Theatre Company had employed some people to perform in a particular play. They performed, they're not profiting off the body, so to speak, to use that emotive-laden term. They employed someone to actually do that task. It is ridiculous to say they are commodifying black and brown bodies when they're in fact employing people as actors. That's a very different thing. By their logic, all work is commodification. Now that, to some extent, is a slightly separate issue. One can have that debate, but it is invalid to say they are commodifying a particular group of people for doing the same task as another group of people that is supposedly not commodified. It is clearly logically inconsistent. Furthermore, in terms of silencing people in this case, well, like I said, donors are entitled to withdraw their donations and subscribers are entitled to not pursue a subscription. And if this has a financial impost, then that company needs to look at, well, what is going to cause the viability of our firm? And they need to employ actors that people are actually going to want to go out and see. If people don't want to see an actor in a performance, then that actor doesn't get work. That's how acting works. So it really is the nature of the game. Now, in terms of staying silent, again, I have no particular issue with actors having a political view. I have an issue with actors forcing that view upon everyone else and expecting us all to actually take them seriously. They then conclude with a graceful, justifiably angry, digital or live. It is increasingly clear that to stand for the right for Palestinians to live in a liberated and safe environment is not only punishable, but must be apologized for. The show mustn't go on as usual when people are being massacred. And they sign off, from the river to the sea, always was, always will be. Again, erroneously tying indigenous causes with the cause of the Palestinians. And again, glossing over the fact that Hamas kidnapped, murdered, and tortured innocent civilians. That's obviously a terror act and something that they have failed to condemn. They're failing to condemn the intentional murder of people, which is an order of magnitude worse, because it connotes intention to go out and murder someone. The letter overall is a trash fire and an exercise in what not to say to cool down a situation. Now, to me, actors can have an opinion on politics, but it is no more valuable or less valuable than anyone else's. You don't need, for example, a PhD or to be called a so-called expert to have an opinion. But it is vital to articulate a case and support that case with evidence for that opinion to carry very much weight. And the actors appear to be completely incapable of doing this. They're assuming that because they happen to appear on stage, their opinion on politics is any more valuable than anyone else's opinion, even if they haven't actually devoted serious thought to that opinion. They seemingly think that their supposed popularity is sufficient for their opinion to actually carry weight. But like I've said, actors can say whatever they want. They have free will. But people also have free will to call them out when they say something crazy and to simply not listen. Actors don't get to cry bully and bludgeon their way into acquiescence. Actors don't get to tell other people to be silent when they call the actors out for making rather strange protests, or at least misrepresenting the totality of the case. The actors here, to my mind, act just like crybaulers often do. They like to bludgeon people over the head to get their way, but when they're called out, they go and cry foul. It's hypocrisy at its finest. But do nevertheless let me know your thoughts about actors and celebrities giving political statements, and whether you think they carry any weight in the comments below.